One of the things that I enjoy using Ingold for as a history of anthropological thought, and I've in some ways enjoyed this book as a history of anthropological thought more than I thought I would, is that Ingold, like Trujillo, what he seems to care about is trying to understand what organisms are doing, how they develop biologically in an environment, how we behave, and how we think and communicate. And so he fastens onto those ideas, and then he just goes in a direction wherever it's going to take him. Sometimes it takes him into anthropology, sometimes into famous anthropologists like Levi-Strauss or Franz Boas, sometimes into really obscure anthropologists and philosophers, other people, sometimes into debates that we might wonder if they're still relevant today. That is true, but the pursuit is of the idea and of the concept. And so there are certainly times that I wish that Ingold were more running into authors like Yarimar Bonilla or Jonathan Rosa, and running into people and those kinds of ideas that perhaps are more immediate to some of our contemporary concerns. But I think the overall big picture ideas are exactly what you would sort of run up against if these are the things that you're trying to think through. That is to say, if you're trying to understand, well, how do we as organisms relate? How do we grow and develop and relate to our environment? You're going to run up against what Ingold calls these three tricks. That is to say, these are the ways in which these disciplines have been built and teach us to understand how these things happen in the world. And so the trick of biology, or of much contemporary biology, as Ingold tells us back in the last chapter on page 382, is that you look at an organism and you observe what it looks like and how it behaves in its morphology and its phenotype, and then you say, aha, that must be the blueprint or the genome. And so in this wonderful quote on 382, Ingold says, where is the genotype? There can be only one possible answer: in the mind of the biologist. The genotype, I would argue, is the outcome of biologists' attempts to write a program or algorithm for the development of the organism in the form of a coherent system of epigenetic rules. These rules are derived by abstraction from the organism's observed characteristics in a manner analogous to the way in which a linguist would derive the rules of syntax by abstraction from a sample of recorded utterances. So I'm already telegraphing the third trick here, which is that of the linguist. So the biologist is taking the behavior and the phenotype and then saying, aha, it must have already been there. It must have already been there in the genotype. But anthropology hardly escapes from the same scathing critique, which is that we go out as anthropologists and we observe behavior and what people say and what people are doing, and then we say, aha, that must be culture. That must be their culture being manifest as this behavior, the culture that provides the blueprint for their behavior. From page 387, thus culture as a body of context-independent, traditionally transmitted knowledge encoded in words or other symbolic media can exist nowhere except in the mind of the anthropological observer. It is derived by abstraction from observed behavior in just the same way that the biologist derives the genotype by abstraction from the observed characteristics of the organism, and the linguist derives a grammar from the record of utterances. And by the same trick, We have already noted in the fields of linguistics and biology, this abstraction is imagined to be implanted within the minds of the actors themselves as the generative source of their behavior. And so skipping up into today's chapter, chapter 22, speech, writing, and the modern origins of language origins, we see again these tricks reiterated on page 395 to 396, how the biologists seek to redescribe the observed phenotypic characteristics of organisms as the outputs of a formal system of epigenetic rules. And then on page 399, with the linguists who take these objective systems of rules and representation and say that this language exists and is implanted in somebody's head, all of our heads, in fact, and that is what enables me to speak and to form sentences and to do things in the world. And so, again, what we are most interested in as people who have come to this college and has come to study anthropology is, how do people work? How do we live in the world? How do we do things? How do we think? How do we act? And these have been the ways that we've been taught that people do things. Is basically they have been given a biological species essence, we've been given a cultural essence, and we've been given language in our heads already. Now, I think it does help to revisit a little bit why these tricks were originally emerged, or what was the original reason for this linguistic anthropology thing. Like, where did this come from? Why did people insist that language was independent and a species characteristic, which was then filled in by the content of these rules? And in the old school West, the idea was that only the very top people, especially the Europeans with languages like French and German, I don't even know if English would count, but now it counts so highly that we'll just put it in there, that these were the true languages. And those were the languages that mattered and that people actually had, and that other people out there didn't have language at all. If you want to go back to page 65 and that wonderful quote from Charles Darwin, whoops, I can't go back because that part of my book is at home. The idea is that their languages are scarcely articulate. And so there became this division between language that was considered true language and language that was considered inarticulate, baby talk, too hybrid to count as language. And so linguistic anthropology and linguistics in general, of course, did some fighting against this. We said, they said, no, everybody has language, and that there is not language inequality. They're just different. And that in fact, language is a species characteristic of human beings, that we are all born able to, as we learned in the last class, in the sort of the Goethean notion of pre-equipped for 1,000 forms of life, that we could learn any one of the world's 7,000 languages, or how many there are, but we just happen to be born into the 1 or 2 or 3 that we're born into. And so the language just sort of gets filled in. And I could have been a speaker of Italian or Korean or Swahili, but it was all innately possible because of this language acquisition device. And so anthropology was perhaps admirably, trying to fight against some seriously racist notions about who has language and who doesn't, and some serious notions about superiority and inferiority. But in so doing, as Ingold has been telling us throughout this book, we did a couple of things. One is it extends the idea, the sort of Western ideal of language, culture, it extends it across humanity in a way that basically enshrines our own notions of what language and culture should be, but then extends them out all over to all creatures. So that's, for Ingold, that's the most problematic part of it. For others, perhaps in the US context, and I think perhaps for someone like Jonathan Rosa, the problem is it hasn't worked. These ideas about people that don't have language and people who do have language, and the idea that languages are equal and we should celebrate language diversity, that racism has disappeared because people don't believe in biological racism, it just hasn't quite worked, and maybe is even in some cases might be considered worse than before. So in the last class, we looked at how the idea of bilingualism in Rosa's work, the idea of they're bilingual, they don't know the language, we've gone to this idea that instead of talking about people's language capabilities, we're talking about people as having no language at all. And so part of what Rosa is doing is trying to address this balance that the traditional approach obviously has not had much impact out there in the world in terms of our language ideologies. And as Ingold has told us throughout, these things that seem so oppositional are often oppositional because they are based on shared premises, which is something that comes out in Rosa's chapter on the inverted Spanglish a couple times on page 147, where he's talking about a debate between the clearly opposing viewpoints in a now familiar debate between multiculturalism and assimilation. But at the same time, he says that that very debate between are we able to assimilate and are we able to be multicultural rests on a shared set of assumptions about language itself, which basically makes English out to be the best language for various reasons, and racializes others and basically marks them as different and other. So again, for various reasons, we might want to at least question this trumpeting of the idea of that everyone has language as a species characteristic. The way that Ingold is going to do it is in a few different ways, is that instead of looking at language as some sort of inbuilt capacity or a device, he wants to tell us that the way we actually learn to speak and the way that infants are able to then start to assemble this language and learn apparently quite quickly and amazingly the languages of their speech communities is, for one thing, because it begins in the sensory experience of the womb. Ingold notes on 397, recent research has shown that from well before birth, infants are sensitive to the surrounding ambience of sound and above all to the mother's voice. Drawing on some wonderful psychological experiments in which, by flashing lights into infants' eyes while they played different sounds, they were able to figure out that the infant preferred the language of the language or languages of its, what we might call its native languages at 2 days after birth, which was kind of incredible. But the point is people are already, as we talked about with the genome, they're already in an environment, already experiencing, already developing in this richly structured environment. And so what Ingold says is that you don't actually just acquire language. It is not acquired. It is an ability that is continually being generated and regenerated in the developmental context of children's involvement in worlds of speech. So there's not some point at which I said, aha, I now have acquired the English language. I now have learned Spanish. Now I know it. It's always being generated, in some cases lost, if you don't keep using it. And so it's not something that you can say that you've acquired. It always has to be being continually learned. And so what Ingold is saying is that speech, as we've seen in the chapter on birds' nests, that speech is a skill. And so, skills and skilled practice, it's a way, on page 401, efforts to make ourselves understood in a world which is never quite the same from one moment to the next. So in the same way that a person feels their way through the world, we feel our way through speech, we feel each other's presence in the world. So this is Ingold's view of how speech develops. I would say that there's also a backup to this, that even if you want to keep arguing that all humans have a language acquisition device or some sort of capacity, you can't ever separate that from the process of development. So there's no way that whatever this capacity is, could have been wired up before you were already immersed in the world. As we've seen, it's coming about in the development of the womb itself. So it's coming about before the child even enters into the world. So you can't really, even if there were such a device, you couldn't separate it out from the developmental process. So after that, Ingold goes into some interesting ideas about contrasting or contrasting speech and writing. And one of the most interesting things, I think, is where we got the idea of language as a set of rules and conventions from in the first place. Where do we get that from, Willa? Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty fascinating. He's saying that that our idea of we've had this idea that people have language and that's what came about first in the past, but that actually our idea of language as these kind of syntactic rules and representation actually comes from what he thinks is a mistaken idea about writing as a mechanical form of composition. Let's see. Actually, it might be good to, well, he says here on page 399, the whole idea that, language has an objective system of rules and representations. And he says that when we're speaking in ordinary speech, these conditions never obtain. A real life verbal composition is inseparable from performance, and performance is an intentional and finely nuanced activity that draws its meaning from the situational context of its enactment. So in real life, we're trying to make something happen by speaking. In modern literate societies, however, there is one domain of activity where the conditions outlined above approximately obtain, and this is the activity of writing. And so in writing, we're able to, as we're doing here with reading, we're able to put things down in sentences. We're trying to make them fit next to each other and obey certain rules that in speaking, we rarely do unless we're just reading somebody's writing. He goes into here a kind of a little bit of, I don't know if it's an aside, but there was a sort of a debate about literate and non-literate societies. And basically he's saying that some of the people who have been talking about non-literate societies describe writing as if it were equivalent to tool use, equivalent to using tools, and therefore entails a technology. And we've seen, and we won't go back into this, we've seen this idea that just because you're using tools doesn't mean you have the ideas that we have of skill and some of the ideas about the violin as a mechanical contrivance were kind of interesting to read, in the sense that some of the people who've been thinking about this do not seem to understand what it is that a tool or a mechanical contrivance or a violin is for. Ingold wants to make a couple of points about writing. And again, he's saying that writing is not just tool use, and that we have some strange ideas about it. So one of the things he's emphasizing is that writing is itself a skill. It's a technique of the body, and we do it in all different kinds of ways and fashions. It's a whole body activity. It can involve various tools and postures and inscribing practices. And so as he says on page 403, just like speech, writing is an achievement of the whole human organism person in their environment. Someday I'm going to rewrite Ingold. I'm going to get rid of all the his's and hers. I'm going to use theirs and theys. Just because, why do you have to say his or her environment? Just say their environment and have it be. So, writing is achievement of the whole human organism person in their environment. I guess that's technically incorrect grammatically still, but we're going for it. And that writing emerges just as naturally as speaking does. And this is very comparable to how we talked about cycling and walking. That if you give people the right equipment and the right supports and the right scaffolding, walking emerges naturally, but so will cycling. And the same thing with writing. It's not more or less instinctive. Page 404, as varieties of skilled practice, both speaking and writing emerge quite naturally in the course of development, so long as the necessary support structure or scaffolding is present in the environment. And I think this seemed very true for me. Having two children, the children of academics, it wasn't, reading and writing weren't really differently emerging than speaking. It just happened. It wasn't that big a deal. In the same way, it wouldn't be a big deal if a kid grabs a clarinet, if you're a clarinetist, and starts pumping away on it. The kids just grabbed the books that were around and started eating them and doing things with them until they eventually learned reading and writing. So again, when the equipment is there, it's not like you learn to speak you are going to learn to speak first, but it kind of occurs almost simultaneously and not with any huge difference in the kinds of skill that it emerges from. Now, I was kind of struck by the literacy section here, but Willa, since you pointed this quote out, I thought we might think about it a little bit here. The page 400, And so Ingold makes a claim here that much of the history of literacy may be understood as a struggle to compensate for this limitation. Oh, what's the limitation? The limitation is that what is not writable and therefore lost in the transcription is everything that gives the spoken utterance its illocutionary force. That is, its power to launch intentions and produce effects, including intonation, voice quality, accompanying manual or face gestures, and so on. So all of these things are what we use to communicate. We're trying to make people understand things. We have all these gestures and tones and things like that, but once we write it down, it's much more difficult to get those. So then he says that much of the history of literacy may be understood as a struggle to compensate for this limitation. I mean, he could underline or italicize or bold compensate in order to emphasize it, to compensate for this limitation, largely through an elaboration of the lexicon to convey subtleties of intention and interpretation that are normally expressed non-lexically in speech. Well, you wondered if this were true, is true. That we made more words. Well, that we did well, I'm thinking about italics and bolding and different things that we do with punctuation marks and how we use those things. I'm thinking about how these, like everybody gets upset that people are texting each other and then they won't learn how to write. But then you have to insert all these emotions and then you never know if the lol is like ironic or not. So then you have to put in a little happy face. To make sure that everybody knows what that means. I don't know. We develop all these little things to compensate for the fact that we aren't there. I mean, even when we're there and talking to somebody, it's sometimes difficult to know what the heck they're trying to say. So we try to read them. That's an interesting expression, reading them, of course. Huh. My son says that he's Lamau, which is, I love that expression too. It's from texting back into speech. Great expression, enables him to say something without even using the words. Ingold cites actually this person. I never looked up this person. He cites David Olson's for his verification is from David Olson's book, The World on Paper, The Conceptual and Cognitive Implications of Writing and Reading, which I haven't read. And then I looked, and Olson has another book called The Mind on Paper, a more recent book. I'm not sure if I would like this, but it's an interesting avenue to pursue it, how writing and the writing techniques changes the way that we think about language and what it's composed of. So I don't know. I don't know if this is all true, but it's an interesting suggestion. So at the end, Ingold wraps back to what he says at the beginning on page 392, but I think he puts it most on page 405, about what we should think about the origin of language. So Ingold is trying to get us to say that the search for the origin of language is impossible, kind of like the origin of the first hut or that takeoff point between history and evolution. Let's see. We would not say, I think, that all human beings have evolved with the innate capacity to play musical instruments, and that this is distinct from the capacity to play the violin, the trumpet, or the oboe. Likewise, it makes no sense to distinguish a universal capacity for language or speech from the ability to speak English, Japanese, or Swahili. Speech is a dynamic phenomenon, and its forms change through history. So, very interested in the changing forms of speech. As it does so, capacities evolve. They are still evolving. And as soon as I read this, I remember when I told you, be careful of the word evolve, because we so associate evolve with better. And as soon as I read this, I was like, is he saying our speech is getting better and better? And I remembered, no, he's not. He's just saying it's changing, it's evolving, it's changing over time. Capacities are evolve and are evolving. And then the wonderful end. Language has not originated yet, and it never will. So in some ways, there's no such thing as language. That language is just an abstraction in the mind of the linguist, which they all told us that we had and had acquired. But in fact, what we do is speech. But you say, hey, wait a second. That doesn't apply to us, because in fact, we have to learn language. And as Ingold says on page 400, there are certain places in modern literate societies where you have these linguists and they copy out these things and they make words and sentences and make us follow all these rules. So that language has become an institution. And then in these places, it gets imposed on people in the name of lining themselves up. I think actually, you may have quoted this, Willa. In most, the forms of speech shows to bring them into line with these artificial scribal conventions, setting up canons of correctness against which actual utterances may be judged more or less well-formed, and which citizens are encouraged or sometimes forced to emulate. And in Ingold's words, they are sometimes forced to emulate them, but I think he should amplify that a whole lot more. I think people are increasingly forced to emulate standard forms, or really, really super encouraged to emulate them in ways that maybe are getting crazy. And so I think that this may help us, or may lead us over into Rosa's chapter, where he talks about the herderian, as in the sense of Herder, who came up with this ideology of one language, one nation, one people, so that all people were supposed to have one language, or not, all the people in a given territory called a nation were supposed to have one language. And so in this sense, as we've been talking about, that this idea that there is a correct way to speak is actually devaluing the speech skills of the people involved. And that instead of, as we saw in the last chapter, instead of celebrating the idea that they might be bilingual and have multiple linguistic abilities, that becomes being bad at Spanish and at English, and thus having no language at all, or languagelessness. Or in this chapter, as we've seen before, the speakers or the people that Rosa is studying, whatever language they're speaking, whether that be monolingual English or somewhat accented English or Spanish, are always heard as speaking Spanish. This is on 149. Throughout the United States, Latinxes look like the Spanish language and Spanish sounds like Latinxes. This means that Latinxes are imaginatively heard to be speaking Spanish, regardless of whether they're speaking from what many perspectives might be perceived as unaccented English, or have experienced minimal socialization to or through the Spanish language.